In the mornings, Constantinople comes alive with bodies and rumors. Adult servants with baskets stretch from the ship's pier to the palace, the sick to the monastery infirmaries, and officials to the offices. Stories circulate among them. The emperor allegedly lingered too long on one lady. The empress receives suspicious people late at night. One of the noblewomen has too loose manners at court. A crude picture emerges. Byzantium as a huge house of gossip, where power is decided behind closed doors rather than in councils. Hello. This is a story about how the imperial court of Anna Komnene's time controlled not only land and taxes, but also the movements of every adult body near the throne. It is about how strict ceremony, audience schedules, and archives proved stronger than gossip and market rumors. Write in the comments which city and country you are from, and what myths about debauched Byzantium you have most often encountered in books and films. Share which modern stories about how protocol protects or destroys reputations seem most disturbing to you. I wish you attentive and slightly nervous listening. Beyond the beautiful mosaics of the palace, you will see registers, guards, and very strict etiquette. The imperial court, which Anna, daughter of Alexius Komnenos, enters, is much closer to an office than to the harem of European fantasies. The emperor's morning is marked by steps, prayer, medical examination, a narrow council, receiving petitions, and going out to the townspeople. Each meeting is filtered by eunuchs and officers, who, when, and at what distance can approach the ruler. A century before the Komnenos, Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus wrote in his Book of Ceremonies exactly how the emperor should enter, where to stand, and who is allowed to take how many steps toward him. It was a blueprint for the ideal court, where even the movement of a hand was turned into a point of protocol. Anna was born into a different political situation, but she grew up in a space where these old instructions still set the rhythm of life. At the same time, another reality existed in the city: the market, the docks, the monastery courtyards, where the secrets of the palace were retold. Here, it was easier to believe that everything was decided by the emperor's favorites than to understand the complex chains of positions and titles. Later, Western authors, irritated by Byzantine bureaucracy, will gladly pick up on this image. The empire as a female realm of intrigue, where the empress and court ladies supposedly moved troops by changing their positions in boxes and bedrooms. This image easily outlived the Komnenos themselves because it fit well with the stereotype: a foreign empire, therefore corrupt and treacherous. Anna Komnene, already an adult woman writing the Alexiad after her father's death, sees how such myths undermine power. In Byzantine practice, a blow to the bed often attempts to destroy the throne. A hint of the empress's impurity calls into question her children, the dynasty, and the heir. There had already been cases in the history of the empire when the wives of rulers were accused of having affairs with eunuchs, favorites, and foreign ambassadors. And these stories were used not for entertainment, but as weapons in the hands of the opposition. Anna lives in a world where one careless touch or an ill-conceived schedule of visits can become a reason for a political attack. Her response is not to justify every rumor, but to demonstrate that access to the emperor and empress is structured by such strict protocol that most scandalous moments are physically impossible. This is particularly clear in her description of her mother, Irene Dukaina. Anna emphasizes not her romantic appeal, but her rigid restraint of movement. Her mother avoided showing even her hands and face to unfamiliar men, and tried to ensure that her voice did not carry freely to unaccustomed ears. This is the image of the ideal empress in the Byzantine code, not a socialite hostess, but an almost veiled body, present but seemingly excluded from everyday exchanges of glances. Modesty here is not a personal whim, but an element of state protection. The fewer reasons for gossip, the more difficult it is for the opposition to build campaigns on insinuations. Behind this lies a specific organization of the day. The empress does not walk alone in the garden. She moves with a clearly defined escort. Her receptions are a chain of formal meetings. Noble wives, relatives of dignitaries, abbesses of monasteries, spouses of foreign ambassadors. Their names are entered into lists. The time of the visit is scheduled in advance, and witnesses are present. Joint appearances with the emperor are also strictly scheduled. Religious processions, holidays, meals. The inner chambers of the palace were guarded by eunuchs, for whom violating the access regime meant the end of their careers and the risk of corporal punishment. In such a system, any special visit inevitably left a mark in the memory of the guards, in the records of the ceremony, in the guard schedule. At the same time, in Byzantine political culture, the body is treated cruelly, but in its own codified way. Adult relatives of emperors who lost the struggle for power were not always killed, but they were crippled and isolated. They were blinded, deprived of the ability to walk without assistance, and forcibly tonsured as monks. These punishments were called bloodless, but they left lasting pain and permanently removed a person from the political game. Anna herself would become a participant in an unsuccessful conspiracy against her brother and end her days in a monastery, where her body and voice would be confined within walls. For her, talk of bodily etiquette was not theory, but fate. The court protected some bodies and broke others, and both were done through formal procedures. In later ceremonies based on the work of Constantine Porphyrogenitus, researchers see another important layer of control. Not only the order of holidays is fixed, but also the regime of visibility of the imperial family. It literally specifies on which days and at what times the ruler and his spouse must be available to different groups: senators, military leaders, monks, ordinary citizens. Anything that goes beyond this corridor becomes suspicious, and this is precisely what the defense mechanism against rumors is based on. When the opposition tries to launch a scandalous story, supporters of the court can pull out the list of audiences from the archives and show that at the specified time, the empress was in a different place, with other people, under guard, and not in some fictitious secret chambers. Anna Komnene, recounting her father's reign, persistently returns the reader to these dry lines. Who had access, in what capacity, and for what reason? Where the European reader expects stories of love intrigues, she talks about the distribution of functions, appointments, military campaigns, confiscations, and diplomacy. The female bodies on the pages of the Alexiad are almost always inscribed in official roles: charity, monastic patronage, participation in religious ceremonies. This is her own response to the myth of Byzantium of the bed. She replaces it with a story of Byzantium of protocol, where the fate of the state is decided through cold schedules and archives rather than through whispers behind curtains. This perspective is especially noticeable when comparing Anna's text with Byzantine ceremonial rules. Alongside her descriptions of the court are instructions that spell out exactly how adult bodies should move in space. Who enters the hall first? Who stands up? Who is required to touch the ground with their forehead? And who is allowed to limit themselves to a bow? Even the distance between the emperor and the petitioner is regulated. To an outside observer, this looks like excessive theatricality. For the court, it is a system that allows any gesture to be turned into proof or refutation. If opponents claim that a certain woman is too close to the ruler, it is enough to open the schedule of audiences and point out that she had no right to approach him without the presence of a eunuch and a number of witnesses. Anna writes her text after she herself has lost the struggle for power. Her attempt to depose her brother, John II, was not a romantic drama, but a very material stake. Whose line would control the army, taxes, confiscations, and marriages? Defeat meant not only a loss of influence, but also biographical sterilization. She was removed from the political body of the empire and sent to a monastery, where she remained an educated but isolated adult woman. In this position, she understood particularly well how attacks on reputation were constructed. Accusations of promiscuity or improper relationships were almost always aimed either at the empress or at the wives of the ruler's closest associates, because this was a way to undermine the legitimacy of the entire house. At the same time, Anna, defending her parents, does not paint them as physically perfect. She honestly shows her father's physical frailty, his illnesses, his exhaustion from wars and sleepless councils, describing his trembling hands, bouts of pain and weakness. In the Byzantine context, the physical infirmity of the ruler does not negate his right to power if the ceremonial ring around him is correctly constructed. An emperor who cannot stand for long will sit on the throne, but the order of entry of ambassadors, the number of steps, and the number of bows remain the same. The body weakens, but etiquette preserves his unapproachability. This also serves as a defense against gossip. As long as the formality is observed, it is more difficult to turn talk of the weakening of power into an open coup. The opposition, as is often the case, tries to play by different rules. Its weapons are anonymous leaflets, whispers in monasteries, and stories from pilgrims who spread the truth about the court in the provinces. There, they tell stories about favorites, about special night visits, about how decisions are allegedly made in bed rather than in council. These stories can rarely be verified, but they play on emotions. It is easier to believe that the empire is falling because of female weakness and debauchery than to understand the systemic errors of tax policy or military strategy. Anna deliberately contrasts this with a stream of facts: the dates of campaigns, the composition of embassies, lists of officials. She shows that the real blows to the empire come not from the bedroom, but from the treasury, from failures in defense, from the betrayals of commanders who change sides in exchange for land and gold. Against this backdrop, it is particularly clear how the bureaucracy tries to suppress the very possibility of manipulation of the theme of the body. Ceremonial rules include not only the order of holidays, but also dress codes. Adult women at court are prescribed a certain sleeve length, fabric density, and veil shape. This is not for the sake of beauty, but for the sake of control. The less visible the body is under clothing, the more difficult it is to construct a scandalous plot around it. Violations of dress codes were punished in the same way as violations of financial discipline, with a report, a reprimand, and sometimes dismissal from court service. To a historian, this may seem like a maniacal obsession with form. For people living within this system, it was a way to turn the body into an element of protocol rather than a free surface for rumors. Byzantine medical and monastic texts add another layer: fear of the weakness of the body and its infectiousness with sin. Doctors of that time associated many diseases with lifestyle, habits, diet, and an excess of heat and moisture. Ascetic authors wrote about the need to limit touch, gaze, and taste so as not to excite excessively. In the imperial environment, these ideas turned into practical recommendations: fewer casual contacts, more filters and intermediaries, a clear division of male and female spaces in the palace. All this also worked as a shield against bedroom myths, but at the same time created real pressure on those whose lives were spent in these corridors. Adult women at court live in a state of constant vigilance. Any wrong move, too long a conversation, too free a laugh can be interpreted as a violation of bodily etiquette and used against them in political games. By the time Anna was working on the Alexiad, the Byzantine tradition already had an archive that could be used as a weapon against slander. The chancelleries kept copies of decrees, ceremony protocols, and reception reports. If someone starts a rumor that the empress received suspicious people in an inappropriate place on a certain day. The court's supporters have the opportunity to pull up the records and show where she actually was: in a monastery, at a church service, in the official reception room. These documents did not always save the court from the slow impact of rumors, but at important moments, during investigations of conspiracies, at councils, during changes of power, they became a decisive argument. Bureaucracy and ceremony here act not only as an instrument of control, but also as the only defense against the myth of the empire of the bed, in which the fate of the state is supposedly decided by unverifiable nighttime stories. The late European image of Byzantium cemented a different picture, almost unrelated to what Anna saw. In the chronicles of Latin authors and texts of the modern era, the imperial court is transformed into a club of female intrigues, where adult empresses and favorites allegedly pull the strings of power, whispering in bed. Audience schedules, fasting days, and the paralyzing protocol of holidays are almost invisible there. Instead of the difficult language of officials, titles, and councils, they draw a simple line: the mistresses decided everything. In this context, the Alexiad is an attempt to protect the family and the still-living empire by relying on the boring but verifiable side of the court. Bureaucracy, scandal as a weapon, always strikes at the most vulnerable point. In Byzantine society, this is the reputation of an adult woman in power. The empress, the emperor's sister, the ruler's adult daughter, they are convenient targets. A blow to their purity allows one to question marriages, heirs, and allies. Anna knows that her dynasty has a history of similar stories. Legends had already circulated in the palace about empresses accused of having affairs with eunuchs or military commanders. It is almost impossible to verify such claims, but rumors slowly erode trust. In response, Anna builds a ring of dates, positions, and functions around her family, showing that real political shifts take place in the council and on the battlefield, not in the bedroom. In her description of the palace, there are almost no chambers, but many halls and procedures. She talks in detail about the throne room, reception rooms, visits to the army, and negotiations. The empress and the women of the court appear in the context of charity and worship, monasteries, distributions, church celebrations. Anna emphasizes that her mother, being an adult woman with influence, lives in strict seclusion from outside men, and her power is manifested through letters and council decisions. This is both personal protection and a demonstration of conformity to the ideal. The right empress is one whose body is almost completely dissolved in protocol. The opposition acts differently. Everything physical is easier to fit into an anonymous leaflet that will be distributed on the benches. There, they record not the discussion of taxes, but alleged night visits, not the structure of the council, but suspicious glances at the holiday. These texts do not end up in the archives, but remain in the memory, where ceremony requires precision, the ruler's departure time, the list of attendees, the sequence of bows. The leaflet is vague. Instead of dates, it says always. Instead of facts, it says everyone knows. Anna responds with a dense layer of chronology. She ties key decisions to councils, campaigns, famine, and the invasion of the Crusaders, pulling the narrative out of bed and into the realm of naked politics. When she talks about conspiracies, the body is almost always present as an object of punishment, not pleasure. Adult rivals are blinded, deprived of their tongues, sent to monasteries with strict rules. They prefer bloodless measures that leave a person alive but take them out of the game. Against this backdrop, stories about promiscuous favorites turn into a light smoke, covering decisions about the mutilation of relatives, confiscations, and forced marriages. Ceremonial books and court statutes serve as an antidote to specific accusations. If there is talk of a secret meeting, they bring out the schedules and show where the empress was at the relevant time and who witnessed it. For the rumor to be true, it would have to break several levels of protocol at once: the guard, the testimony, the entrance ritual, which seems incredible to people inside the system. But this same protocol is a constant pressure. Adult women at court live within a dense network of rules. Clothing, hand position, gait, gaze, everything is regulated. Any deviation becomes a future argument for enemies. The body constantly balances between the status of a symbol and the status of potential evidence. Anna feels this firsthand when, after Alexius's death, she participates in an attempt to promote her husband and brothers against John. At this point, she is no longer perceived as the subject of rumors, but as a channel of influence. The emperor's daughter and the commander's wife connects the lines of claim. The failure makes her the body for another ritual. She is cut off from the court, effectively confined to a monastery, her clothes, gestures, and routes changed. All that remains of her old status is the ability to speak through text. The urban and medical background makes everything even more tense. Constantinople lives under the risk of epidemics, famines, and a stream of wounded people. People see the court in fragments, motorcades, candles in the temple, the distant silhouette of the empress. The rest is filled in by rumors. In such an environment, stories about favorites spread as quickly as an infection. Anna, relying on ceremonies and archives, tries to offer a different perspective. Not sighs behind curtains, but heavy lists of bread, negotiations, and appointments of commanders. And every time the ceremonial fails, the emperor's illness, the death of the heir, the fall of a nobleman, it depends on whether the bureaucracy manages to explain what happened, that the version about the council and the war will prevail, or the version about the bed, in which someone moved someone else. When the bureaucracy is the first to respond, we see how the myth of bedroom Byzantium crumbles when confronted with paperwork. At the Komnenos court, many sensitive issues were attempted to be diffused through the public display of protocol. When rumors spread that the empress or an adult woman close to her was exercising undue influence, the response was not an emotional defense, but a demonstrative observance of ceremony. The empress appeared at official church services, accompanied by strict eunuchs and elderly court ladies, received ambassadors at open doors, sat at a proper distance from the ruler, and then left by the route prescribed by the charter. This was enough for the people who lived inside the palace to understand that even if enemies were building stories around her body, the real space of her movements was blocked by walls and the eyes of witnesses. Eunuchs played a special role here, adult men who were specifically placed between the female half and the rest of the world. In Western tradition, they were often portrayed as suspicious and intriguing figures, but in reality, they served as walking barriers. Letters, gifts, and requests passed through them into the palace. They also controlled who could enter the parts of the palace where the empress and other women lived, and at what time. There were abuses on their part as well. A eunuch could delay a message, ask for a reward for help, or build his own network of clients. But despite all this, the system did one thing. It removed direct contact between women and random petitioners, turning a breeding ground for rumors into an area where every step had to go through a layer of services and positions. The Komnenian era provides another important example: the clash with the Crusaders. People arriving in Constantinople from Western lands brought with them a set of stereotypes about the debauched Eastern court. They expected to see a chaotic harem, free access to the ruler and his family, and an open mixing of the intimate and the political. Instead, they were met with a system of halls, corridors, and schedules. They could wait for hours for an audience, passing from one guard to another, seeing only the distant silhouette of the ruler, who invariably appeared in a crown. surrounded by priests and dignitaries. The empress and princesses were visible only from a distance during Sunday and holiday services, where their bodies were completely covered by heavy clothing and veils. For those accustomed to explaining power through the bed, this was a disappointment, and some Western chroniclers took revenge in their writings, painting even more fantastical pictures of behind-the-scenes debauchery, precisely because in reality they encountered a cold wall of ceremony. The archive, which is rarely thought about, was no less important a layer of protection than the palace walls. The Byzantine chancellery employed adult scribes whose task was to record what could be shown and sent: decrees, letters, reports. When conspiracies and investigations took place, it was these people who brought old documents to light, who was appointed when, who spent how much time in exile, who received a monastery or a plot of land for loyalty. In disputes over the legitimacy of marriage or the right to the throne, it was not a piece of paper about the alleged decline in morals that was decisive, but a scroll with a seal confirming the union, inheritance, or agreement with other houses. A physical myth could not undo lines written decades ago under a golden seal. At the same time, archival discipline itself required rigorous physical practices. Scribes and officials lived in a world where the eyes, hands, and backs of adults were working tools. Long hours at desks, dim light, cold in poorly heated rooms, joint pain from constant sitting, deteriorating eyesight, the flip side of the very documentation that protected the imperial family from slander. On one side was the legend of Oriental pleasures, on the other, the real bodies of scribes who aged and broke down in the service of protocol. Their work was considered important for political results. Without verified formulas and dates, any justification of power lost its force. Anna, as an author, uses these mechanisms when she writes about her own defeat. She does not hide the fact of the conspiracy, nor does she portray herself as a victim of pure malicious slander. She notes that there was a struggle for power, that there were decisions that could be considered risky or erroneous. But in the logic of her text, the key question is not who seduced whom or who is whose favorite, but who had the legal right to command and consult at what point. She shows that after Alexius's death, the balance of power changed, that her brother gained the support of powerful figures, and that the court decided to cut her and her husband off from access to military resources. This description does not negate the pain, but it does deprive the opposition of the opportunity to reduce everything to a simplified scheme of female intrigue. The social reality of Constantinople completes the picture. There were real areas of physical vulnerability in the city: poor neighborhoods, overcrowded houses, markets where violence easily broke out, hospitals and shelters where people sick with epidemics were taken. Adult women and men in these places faced the harsh, ugly side of life every day: beatings, forced labor, infections. Against this backdrop, court stories about favorites were for many simply an entertaining shell, a mask over the harsh reality of everyday life. The danger began when these stories started to be used as an explanation for real political failures. Then, instead of analyzing why the army did not arrive on time or why the treasury was empty, a convenient version appeared. Someone at the top is spending too much time elsewhere. With her dry, heavy text, Anna tries to draw attention back to the fact that the emperor's illness, the mistakes of the commanders, the pressure of the crusaders, and the tax burden are explained not by the bedroom, but by decisions recorded in acts and ceremonies. From this perspective, Byzantine body etiquette ceases to be an exotic curiosity. It appears to be a rigid, at times inhumane tool used by those in power to shield themselves from rumors and simultaneously control their own subjects. The bodies of the ruler and his family are covered with several layers: clothing, itineraries, schedules, and official documents. An opponent who tries to attack through bedroom gossip is forced to either run into the wall of this protocol or look for other points of attack: finances, military defeat, internal alliances. Anna Komnene, sitting in a monastery and reminiscing about life in the palace, shows precisely this side of Byzantine history. Behind the myth of the empire of intrigue lies an apparatus where the schedule of audiences and the archive of protocols determine the fates of adults much more than any sheets of paper with hints about night hours. If we bring all these threads together, ceremonial protocol, archives, Anna's personal defeats, we get a picture that doesn't quite fit with the familiar myth of the Byzantine bed. Within the empire, the body was indeed ruled, but this was done not by whispers behind a curtain, but through seating arrangements, regulations, and forms of address. An adult close to the court was not so much a free player in erotic intrigues as the bearer of a carefully constructed role. Every move they made, when to leave, where to stand, whom to approach, and at what distance, became a political gesture that could be recorded, confirmed, or refuted. Where the later European tradition saw the bed as the center, real sources show long corridors, lists of those who appeared, sequences of bows and oaths. What Anna left behind is not a confession in the modern psychological sense, but an attempt to inscribe the body into the language of status and duty. She does not deny that rumors existed, that the opposition attacked the empress, and her threw hints at the feminine nature of their influence. But each time she puts up a wall of documents against this: campaigns against the Normans, the arrival of the Crusaders, tax decisions, monastic statutes that determine how adults who have been removed from the political game live. There is almost no room in this wall for juicy details, not because they did not exist at all, but because they do not explain famine, defeats, forced alliances, or the practice of blinding and exile. In her case, the myth and the document diverge particularly sharply. Myth paints Constantinople as a theater where everything is decided in the bedroom, where the bodies of the emperor and his loved ones are available for the continuous play of desires. The document shows something else: a closed apparatus that, through etiquette and protocol, blocks access to these bodies, turning them into figures covered with cloth and schedules. The rumor continues to live on, in markets, in Latin chronicles, in later novels, because it is easier than talking about taxes, Latin garrisons, or the broken fates of blinded relatives. But those who read the Alexiad alongside ceremonial books are left with a strange aftertaste, more frightening than the fictional bedroom Byzantium, but the one where an adult is deprived of power and freedom by a cold stroke of the pen in an act, and then forced to live for years in a posture dictated not by feeling but by etiquette. It is this Byzantium that is the real backdrop to Anna Komnene's life, a world in which the protocol of the body is heavier and more frightening than any gossip about it.